When I first began practicing Kriya Yoga, I was just about done with college. Um, I had been interested in meditation and philosophy for pretty much all of my semi-conscious life. Once I became a teenager and was able to kind of think for myself and consider things like religion and philosophy. And even before that, even when I was younger, when I would go to Sunday school, because my grandmother at least was a very devout Catholic, and it was expected of me to go to Sunday school and go through confirmation, get First Holy Communion. Whenever I would go to Sunday school, we would study things like the Bible. That was interesting to me. However, as you've probably heard me say before, I would often get kicked out of Sunday school for questioning things that they were trying to teach us. And it seemed like my teachers were really considering that I was just being difficult, when really I wanted to understand what they were saying. I wanted to know why they were talking about what they were talking about and how it made sense. So I always had this drive to know and try to understand how spirituality made sense, how life made sense. So for the majority of my own life, I'd always had an interest in these types of things. And I had begun practicing meditation before I was initiated into Kriya Yoga, before I discovered Autobiography of a Yogi. But then one day, I had a yoga teacher tell me about the book Autobiography of a Yogi. And I can remember going to the mall, back when malls were a thing, with my mom. And it must have been around my birthday, because she wanted to get me something. I was like, oh, well, what about the book Autobiography of a Yogi? So I remember her taking me into one of those things that we used to know as a bookstore and getting this little paperback book. It was kind of small, pretty thick. And I began reading it. And as soon as I began reading that book, I had a sense that this was it. This was the important step to take to eventually, ideally, make sense of all the things I had wondered about, spiritually, philosophically. And once I read that book and I felt that pull or that calling to practice this, I had to figure out, where was I going to go? How was I going to learn this? Who was going to teach me? And a few things occurred in between then and when I was first introduced to Roy Eugene Davis. But when I first made it to CSA, I hadn't ever driven that far by myself. I haven't gone anywhere by myself on any kind of adventure like that. It really wasn't that far, but I hadn't done it. And when I first came on the Center for Spiritual Awareness grounds, I could feel something different. I could hear something. And it was very much like a sound that you hear, or that I heard when I would go into church before anyone else was there, and it was quiet, and you could just almost feel or hear a thrumming, a hum. It was very subtle. And I can also remember hearing it at times when I was out in nature, and it just got perfectly quiet. And there would just be this kind of hum that was kind of palpable. And I wandered around the grounds, made it to my guest house, went down to the meditation hall. And when I went to the meditation hall, it became even louder. That was, I believe, on a Sunday. And I looked at the sheet where it described how this retreat was going to go. And I saw that we were to be at the meditation hall to meditate around 6 a.m., if I recall. And so I went down to the meditation hall, and about 5:45, I walked in and took a seat. The seats were sort of divided, one section on the right, one section on the left. So I walked up the middle aisle, sat in a chair in the middle aisle, and I could see the street light kind of coming in because it was still dark. This was August. Let's see, if I was initiated on the 17th, but it would have been like the 12th or something like that, somewhere around there. But I could see the street light coming in, and it was quiet. People were starting to sit down and meditate. And then I saw this figure walk up the left side, or excuse me, the right side, walk up the right side after the door closed in the back. And he walked up to the altar and he took a lighter and he lit this little oil lamp, this lotus oil lamp. And he took a incense stick and lit it. And while the stick was still burning, he waved it in front of the pictures of Mahavatar Babaji, Lahiri Messiah, Shri Yukteswar, and in between those two at the time was a picture of Jesus, and Paramahansa Yogananda. And at that moment, I was overcome with a sense of, it was like a sense of excitement and anticipation, as well as a feeling of coming home in a way. And I started to cry a little bit, but I kept myself under control. And Roy began to lead the first morning meditation. And he began it with the chant Om Namah Shivaya. And there was a certain kind of sing-song rhythm to it. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. So we chanted that for quite a while. And after we concluded, he explained that it meant, I acknowledge with reverence that supreme infinite consciousness, that Om Namah Shivaya, Om, I acknowledge with reverence, Nama, Shivaya, Shiva, or the supreme consciousness. And then we meditated quietly for about a half an hour. And that was kind of a long time for me at the time. I was relatively new to meditation. Again, I'd been practicing, but not for anything longer than, say, 15 or 20 minutes at a go. So 30 minutes was a bit of a stretch. And we would do that at least twice a day. And after that was done, he concluded, walked out the door, and we had breakfast, and we were scheduled to meet again around 10 o'clock that morning for lecture, kind of like we're doing today at this Kriya Yoga apprenticeship retreat. And I can remember after that lecture, I wanted to introduce myself to him, just to say hi, hello, because we'd exchanged some emails briefly in between then and when I first signed up to go to Center for Spiritual Awareness for the retreat. And I went to shake his hand. So I figured that was the appropriate thing to do because he was very well dressed and well groomed and was not looking anything like a wasn't looking anything like a hippie at all. And he just reached out and gave me a hug and said he was glad that I could be there. So I was a little surprised at that. And that was that. He said, well, I'll see you later on. And he walked off, met with a few other people, and then we had lunch together. So this was the very first day that I was officially experiencing what it meant to be in the realm of Kriya Yoga, I think. And that began many years of attending retreats at CSA, staying in touch with Mr. Davis, meditating daily, doing whatever I could to study the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras, and not just study them, but also apply what I learned. I tried to change my life to be healthier physically, mentally, emotionally. And I can remember I asked to meet with Mr. Davis during the retreat because he would meet with people if they asked. I don't know why. It didn't really... I don't know why I asked to meet with him, because at that point in time, I didn't really have any experience in how this whole retreat thing works. I wasn't one of those people who had already been in the spiritual circles, the retreats, the spiritual realm of these types of things. So I didn't really know how it was supposed to go. I was just barely out of my teens, in my very early 20s. All I knew was West Virginia culture, and what I thought I understood about meditation and yoga. I had not yet been introduced to the whole spiritual community experience, or I hadn't been introduced to those cliques or circles where people just are really into things like spirituality and meditation. But I asked to meet with him. And so we met down at the pond. There were some benches down there. He said, well, just meet me down at the pond. I think it must have been Wednesday. I was thinking it was Thursday, but we usually did the initiations on Thursday, so it must have been Wednesday. And I met with him, and he just asked me what I did, how I became interested in meditation. And one of the first things that came out of my mouth was, I don't know why, but I said, well, when can I learn to teach this stuff? And he looked at me, smiled, and patted me on the back. And he said, well, give it about 5 years. So I said, okay, 5 years sounds good. And that was that. So we met for probably about a half hour at that point in time. He told me to stick with meditation procedures, continue to study, do my best to have a healthy life. And that was the extent of the conversation. After that, when I would meet with him, it was usually for an hour or 2 hours at a time up at his chalet in where his office was on the Center for Spiritual Awareness grounds. Or at times when I'd go there with Melissa, he would come to our guest house and we'd just sit in the living room and talk for a couple hours and have tea. So that began this relationship with Mr. Davis and with Kriya Yoga practice. And I always took it seriously. There was never a point in time where I thought to myself, well, what is this all about? Why am I doing this? There was just always a sense that this is the thing to do. And so even after I completed my first retreat there, as soon as I got home, I made a little space. We lived in a very small apartment with 2 cats and maybe 1 bedroom, and the rest of it was just an open room that had the kitchen and dining room, and there really wasn't anywhere to go. So I took some bookshelves and I made them into like walls. And the space was probably no bigger than 3 feet by 3 feet. The bookshelves were facing out towards the living room, dining room area. And then on the other side, where I was sort of sequestered into this little corner, I don't know where I found this. I had this little metal table that I had had for years. And I put a candle, an incense burner, my Rudraksha beads, and I had pictures of the Kriya Yoga teachers on there. And so every morning I would wake up and I would immediately go sit in that corner. I would light a candle, light a little bit of incense. I would honor and acknowledge the teachers of the tradition. And then I would meditate I would force myself to meditate for an hour. Now, I wasn't very good at it at the time, but I forced myself to do it. So I at least learned to sit still for an hour. And in time, I did eventually get, as Mr. Davis would say, more skillful at the practice. And it was probably another year. It was another year before I returned to CSA. But after I got home from that first retreat, for that entire year before I went down again, every day I went and I sat and I meditated in the morning. And if I had free time, I would also do it in the afternoon, sometimes even in the evening. Luckily, Melissa was also interested in meditation, so I had some easy support there. And I had made friends with 2 people who were older than me, probably 20, 30 years older than me, that were also interested in meditation and yoga. Now, they were a little more eclectic. They jumped around a lot. So after they introduced me to Kriya Yoga, then they moved on to TM and so on, and they wanted me to follow along, and I didn't because I knew Kriya Yoga was the way to go. But I stayed in touch with them. And so many evenings, at least once a week, Melissa and I would go and have tea with them, and we'd meditate together for 45 minutes or so, and then just chat a little bit, maybe have some tea and a cookie or a biscuit, depending on wherever you're from. And that was that. So I arranged my life in such a way after that year so that my primary focus was on spiritual growth. Up until that point, I had read widely. And I had determined that I was going to narrow things down and focus. And I primarily only read the Yoga Sutras, and this was the book that I got a little over 20 years ago now. This is Mr. Davis's Life Surrendered in God. It's a commentary on the Yoga Sutras. It was sort of the precursor to the Science of Self-Realization. And I still have the book, and I still love this book. As you can tell, I have things marked in it. And held up to the test of time. I read the Yoga Sutras, and there's a lot in here to digest. And I read the Bhagavad Gita, the Eternal Way. So Roy Davis's book, The Eternal Way. Again, this is another hardcover. They don't offer the hardcovers anymore, but I got in on the ground floor, so at least when they were offering these things. So all I read was The Eternal Way and the Bhagavad Gita and Autobiography of a Yogi. And I took it slowly, and I studied it as best I could. And one of the reasons I did that, Mr. Davis would tell a story about how when he first met Paramahansa Yogananda, Yogananda told him to only read Yogananda's works for the first year or two. And because Roy was also interested in reading kind of widely. And Yogananda said, you need to do that so that you can develop discernment. Once you understand the basic principles, concepts, then you'll be able to read anything. Then you will understand what is useful, what is true. So I took that to heart. And I began just simply studying the Eternal Way and the Yoga Sutras. And that's a lot. That was enough for me. When I wasn't working, I would go for walks in nature, contemplating what I had read earlier in the morning. Or if I wasn't working and I had some free time, I would go sit outside and take one of these books with me and read. And if I got a little sleepy after a while, I'd just close the book and take a little nap, contemplating kind of what I had been trying to understand. So the majority of the time that I spent after I became interested in Kriya Yoga was directed towards Kriya Yoga. And this is very important. And this is one of the reasons why I prefer to teach Kriya Yoga in the way that we're doing it here with the Kriya Yoga apprenticeship program. Because if you can take a year of your life and commit to listening to weekly lessons and meditating daily, by the time you get to that end, or the end of that year, or even the end of the second year, I know, or at least have a decent idea, that you can stay focused. You can stay, you can pay attention to what needs to be, you can pay attention to what is important. Many people come to spirituality, and I kind of started in this way. They come to spirituality because they want to make this human life better. And to a degree, that will happen. Because if you follow the principles indicated in the Eternal Way, the Yoga Sutras, or if you follow the principles given to you by your meditation teacher, you're going to likely have less problems just because. It's like a person who hangs out with individuals who are getting them in trouble all the time. What's a real easy way to cut out 50% of the negative karma in your life? Stop hanging out with those people who are getting you in trouble. So there's no magic involved in it. And the deeper you go into the process, the more you start to realize what Yogananda had said, which is that the purpose of human life is much different than what we think it is. And he was speaking of people who, just like all of us, were raised in a certain culture where we think the purpose of life is to grow up, have babies, be successful, save the world, make lots of money, get some power. You understand. And that's not the purpose of human life. The purpose of human life is to realize what is true of us beyond the mind, body, and personality so that we can be free internally. And once we're free internally, we can relate appropriately to things like relationships, career, our health, neighbors, the world. We can approach it from a place of understanding. And so the purpose of Kriya Yoga, the reason we start practicing Kriya Yoga is to develop that. And if you're going to start something like this, you need to take it seriously. You need to know why you are doing it. If you're doing it to make your life better, I'm going to save you a lot of time. If you have mental, emotional problems, go see a psychologist. If you've got money problems, go see a business coach or an accountant, or go get a better education so that you can get a job that pays more. If you have relationship problems, well, there's a few things to consider there. Again, counseling might help. But number two, recognize that we're not here for relationships. If they happen, wonderful. But that's not why we are here. And many people seek to define themselves through things like relationships. So most of the human things that you need to do to improve your life require human solutions. The spiritual side of things, that's to give you clarity and greater realization. Many people sell spirituality, saying that you will have better relationships, things will come to you easier, and so on. Number one, to get you interested in it. But number two, because if you actually do practice what is being shared, you will tend to have better experiences, because in order to practice what is being shared, you have to cut out a lot of the things which are problematic, or you have to shift your understanding of life. As an astrologer, many people come to me asking about relationships. When am I going to find my soulmate? When am I going to meet the person that's going to fulfill me, that's going to be able to support me, and so on? And from a spiritual perspective, if you don't have a relationship, that's not a problem. It's likely because what you need to do doesn't require that you have a relationship. It might mean that you have issues that you have to work through, karmas that you have to let go of, attachments that you have to let go of, and they're going to become pristinely clear to you through lack of relationship, because you're not going to be distracted by anyone else's quirks, idiosyncrasies, or neurotic tendencies, or codependence on your part. I'm telling you all this so that you understand, and many of you do already, that Kriya Yoga, the spiritual process, is about freeing you from your identification with pain-producing phenomena. It's about removing the obstacles that, when they are removed, allows you to see what is true of yourself so that you can experience freedom and clarity. Anything else is usually going to be a side benefit that just happens if it's meant to. And if you've come to the practice of Kriya Yoga, it means that on some level, there is a part of you that is ready for this. And if there is a part of you that is ready for this, you also have to be aware of the fact that just because you're ready for it doesn't mean it's not going to take work. It doesn't mean it's not going to take work.